It began on a cloudless Thursday morning in the middle of July, the kind where the sun beat down like a personal grudge. The heat shimmered off the rooftops, turning the neat little suburban street into a wavering mirage. I had just stepped onto my porch with a mug of lukewarm coffee when I noticed it a crisp, white envelope taped neatly to my front door. The HOA seal was stamped across it in bold navy ink, as if they wanted to make sure the whole neighborhood could see their authority from a block away. Inside, the letter was short, but its tone was sharp enough to cut. My lawn, it said, was visibly dry, discolored, and in violation of the community's appearance standards. It demanded immediate action to restore it to an acceptable condition, and included a $500 fine for known compliance. There was no acknowledgement of the fact that we were in the middle of the worst drought in a decade. No mention of water restrictions from the city, and certainly no sympathy for the patchy yellow grass clinging to life under the scorching sun. Stood in my driveway for a long moment, scanning the rows of houses around me. Almost every yard looked the same uniform carpets of bright green grass. Perfectly trimmed to regulation height, a silent testament to the HOA's obsession with conformity, and then there was mine. It wasn't dead, not entirely, but it bore the dusty, brittle signs of nature resisting an impossible demand. The sprinklers hadn't run in weeks, not because I didn't care, but because the city had threatened steep penalties for overuse. Still, the HOA seemed determined to make me. Their latest example, that evening, I checked the neighborhood message board. Sure enough, there was a post from one of the board members passive-aggressive and dripping with condescension about how certain homeowners were letting the community's appearance slide. The comments beneath it ranged from smug agreement to thinly veiled insults. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The seed of an idea had already taken root. Over the next few days, I paid closer attention to the way people looked at my house. Passing cars would slow down just enough for the driver to glance at my yard, shake their head, and move on. A few neighbors avoided eye contact entirely, as if my unacceptable lawn was contagious. But I wasn't embarrassed, I was calculating. If the HOA wanted green grass so badly, maybe I wouldn't give them grass at all. The more I thought about it, the more satisfying the plan became. There was nothing in the bylaws that said a homeowner had to have a lawn. The rules only stated that front yards must be maintained and aesthetically consistent with the community. That wording was vague, deliberately vague. I suspected so. They could enforce it however they pleased. But vague rules worked both ways. I began researching xeriscaping, a landscaping method designed for arid climates. I read about drought-resistant plants, stone pathways, and native cactus gardens that required no watering and almost no upkeep. The pictures I found online were stunning bursts of vibrant succulents, artfully arranged rocks, and tall saguaro, silhouettes against sandy earth. It was the opposite of the monotonous green carpets around me, but it was still beautiful. More importantly, it would be completely legal. One Saturday, I drove out to a local nursery that specialized in desert plants. Rows of towering cacti stood like sentinels, surrounded by trays of smaller succulents in every imaginable shade of green and purple. I walked the aisles slowly, imagining each plant in place of my tired grass. There was something liberating about it, the idea of creating a yard that was mine, not the HOA's. By the time I left, my truck bed was loaded with agave's barrel cacti and low-growing ground cover that thrived in dry soil. The next week, I hired a landscaping crew. The sight of them tearing up the entire lawn must have been a shock to the HOA, because within an hour of the work starting, a board member stopped by. She stood at the curb with her hands on her hips, watching silently as rolls of dead grass were hauled away. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. Not yet. By the time the sun set, my yard was no longer a lawn. It was a blank canvas of rich, sandy soil, ready for something entirely new. I stood on the porch that night, looking out over the empty space and imagining the transformation to come. The HOA wanted me to play their game. I was about to rewrite the rules. The following morning, I woke early to the sound of shovels and wheelbarrows. The crew worked steadily, laying stone pathways that curved like winding trails through the yard. They planted tall cacti in striking clusters, surrounded them with beds of colorful succulents, and added carefully placed boulders for texture. By the third day, the transformation was undeniable. My front yard no longer looked neglected. It looked like a piece of the desert itself had been lifted from Arizona and set down in the middle of our manicured suburban street. But I knew the HOA wouldn't see it that way. By the end of the week, another letter appeared on my door. The new letter was longer this time, printed in the same officious font, but the tone had shifted from cold formality to barely contained outrage. It acknowledged the recent alterations to my property and stated that my new landscaping was not in keeping with the visual character of the community. They demanded I restore the lawn to its previous condition within 14 days or face additional fines. I read it twice, then once more for the satisfaction of knowing exactly what they'd gotten wrong. The bylaws didn't say a lawn had to be grass. They didn't define visual character beyond vague terms like maintained and aesthetically consistent. My yard was both. In fact, it was pristine weed-free, carefully arranged, and far more deliberate than the patchy, overwatered grass some of my neighbors clung to. Still, I knew this wasn't going to be over quickly. The HOA thrived on intimidation, sent letters the way some people sent postcards frequently, and with a casual cruelty meant to wear you down. But I wasn't interested in giving them the satisfaction of seeing me back down. Over the next week, I noticed a steady stream of people slowing their cars to stare at my property. Some just looked curious. Others looked downright offended, as though the presence of a cactus within 100 feet of their home was a personal insult. One morning, while collecting my mail, I caught a glimpse of two board members walking past my house, their voices low and conspiratorial. They pointed at the tall saguaro in the corner of my yard, jotting something in a notebook. It didn't take much imagination to guess they were building a case against me. The funny thing was, not all the attention was negative. Few neighbors I barely knew stopped to compliment the change. One even admitted he was jealous his water bill had doubled last summer, and the city's drought restrictions were only getting tighter. My yard, on the other hand, required no sprinklers, no mowing, and no chemical fertilizers. It was maintenance-free beauty, and it was making the HOA furious. 3 days later, I received a notice of violation stapled to a packet of printed photographs, pictures of my yard from multiple angles, as if I were being investigated by a private detective. The notice claimed my desert landscaping was disruptive to the uniform aesthetic of the neighborhood and accused me of introducing elements that could reduce property values. The fine this time? $1,000. I didn't pay it. Instead, I began gathering my own ammunition. I dug up the HOA's official bylaws, printing out every page. I highlighted the sections about yard maintenance and community aesthetics, noting every vague phrase and every legal loophole. The rules were riddled with ambiguity. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, that prohibited my choice of plants or landscaping materials. I also documented my compliance with the city's drought regulations. The mayor had issued an official order urging residents to replace grass lawns with drought-tolerant landscaping. My yard wasn't just legal, it was exactly what the city wanted. It was going to matter later. Meanwhile, the HOA escalated. It began sending me reminders every 3 days, each one more aggressive than the last. They threatened liens, legal action, and suspension of my access to community facilities. None of it mattered to me. I didn't use the pool. I didn't play tennis. And as for liens, I knew they couldn't legally enforce one over a landscaping dispute without first winning in court. I could tell they were getting desperate. When they started trying to turn the neighborhood against me, a mass email went out from the board, claiming that non-compliant homeowners were endangering property values and threatening the harmony of the community. It didn't name me directly, but it didn't have to. Everyone knew who they were talking about. That night, I saw a small group of neighbors gathered at the corner, glancing toward my house as they talked. Some shook their heads, others shrugged. And then the next morning, something new appeared on my doorstep. Not a letter this time, but a folded flyer. It was an invitation to the next HOA meeting with the agenda clearly listing, discussion of landscaping non-compliance, Lot 47, That was my lot number. It was obvious now. They wanted a public spectacle. They wanted to drag me into a room full of my neighbors and humiliate me into submission. But I had no intention of walking into that meeting unprepared. I was going to show up with every document, every photo, and every piece of evidence I needed to dismantle their argument. And if they thought they could shame me into putting my grass back, they were about to learn what happens when you try to bully someone who knows the rules better than you do. Meeting was in 3 days. I spent every hour leading up to it preparing. The HOA meetings were usually held in the community center, a squat, beige building with a sagging American flag out front and fluorescent lights that made everything inside look slightly jaundiced. On the night of the meeting, the parking lot was already full. Cars lined the curb in both directions, and through the glass doors, I could see folding chairs arranged in neat rows. Every seat occupied at the front of the room sat the board 5 people behind a long table draped with a blue cloth, each with a stack of papers in front of them. The president, a tall, thin man with a too-tight tie, sat in the center. His posture was rigid, his expression somewhere between polite and predatory. On either side, the other board members whispered to each other, occasionally glancing at me. With the kind of strained smiles reserved for unwelcome guests, the room quieted as the meeting began. They moved through the agenda quickly: budget, updates, pool maintenance, reminder about holiday decorations, until they reached the final item. Discussion of landscaping noncompliance, Lot 47. All eyes shifted to me. The president cleared his throat and began reciting the concerns about my property. He spoke with the rhythm of someone reading from a script, pausing just long enough for the other board members to nod solemnly. According to them, my desert style yard was incompatible with community standards, visually discordant, and a potential detriment to neighborhood cohesion. The language was heavy, designed to make something as simple as a cactus sound like a threat to national security. When they finished, the president leaned forward, folding his hands like he was about to deliver the coup de grace. He said that the board had voted to require full restoration of my grass lawn within 30 days and uphold all fines issued to date. A murmur rippled through the audience. Some people nodded in agreement. Others looked uncomfortable. I waited until the room was quiet again before standing. From my bag, I pulled a thick binder, every bylaw, every letter they'd sent me, every photograph I'd taken. I opened it to a marked page and read aloud the exact wording from the HOA rules regarding landscaping. Front yards must be maintained in a manner that is aesthetically consistent with the community. No specific plant species are mandated. No requirement for grass is stated. The president shifted in his chair, but I kept going. I presented the city's drought order, the official encouragement to replace grass with drought-tolerant landscaping. And photographs of my yard taken from multiple angles, each one showing a clean, carefully arranged space. I even included screenshots from real estate listings of nearby homes in similar styles to mine, but with desert landscaping selling for more than the neighborhood average. The board members, a few people in the audience, whispered. I could feel the shift in the room, small at first, but growing with each piece of evidence I laid out. When I was done, I closed the binder and simply stated that my yard complied fully with both HOA rules and city regulations. Therefore, the fines were baseless, and I would not be paying them. For a moment, there was silence. Then someone in the audience, an older man from 3 streets over, spoke up. He said he liked my yard, said it was smart given the water restrictions. Another neighbor chimed in, agreeing. Before long, the murmurs turned into a small chorus of support. Not everyone joined in, but it was enough to make the board uneasy. The president cleared his throat again, this time without the same confidence. He said the board would review the matter further and notify me of their decision in writing. It was an obvious stalling tactic, but it didn't matter. The meeting was over. I'd made my case publicly, and the HOA couldn't pretend I was some lone troublemaker without allies anymore. As I left the community center, I noticed a few neighbors hanging back to talk to me. Some wanted advice on xeriscaping. Others just wanted to say they were tired of the HOA's micromanagement. It was clear I wasn't the only one feeling squeezed, but I also knew the board wouldn't let this go. People like that rarely backed down, they just regrouped. 2 days later, Their decision arrived in my mailbox. The letter was only a single page, but it carried the weight of something much bigger. The board had decided, it said, to pursue an amendment to the community bylaws to ensure that all front yards feature a maintained grass lawn consistent with the neighborhood's historical appearance. They weren't just challenging my yard anymore, they were trying to rewrite the rules to make it illegal. It was a clever move on their part. They couldn't fine me under the current bylaws, but if they could change those bylaws, they'd have the legal ground they needed. And in most HOAs, bylaw changes only required a majority vote from homeowners. If they could convince enough people that my cactus garden was a threat to their property values, I'd be forced to rip it out. Over the next week, it became clear they were campaigning hard. Flyers appeared in mailboxes warning about non-traditional landscaping and its supposed effect on resale prices. The language was vague, but the message was obvious. Board members went door to door, knocking and smiling and explaining how consistency was what kept the neighborhood desirable. They never mentioned me by name, but the implication hung in the air. I didn't wait to react. I started my own quiet campaign. I spoke with neighbors one-on-one, not to convince them that my yard was better, but to remind them what this bylaw change really meant: less freedom for everyone. Today it was cactus gardens. Tomorrow it could be the color of their front door, or the type of flowers they planted. The HOA's control only grew when people gave it to them. Some were skeptical, others sympathetic. A few admitted they'd always wanted to replace their grass but assumed it wasn't allowed. When I told them the truth, that it was perfectly legal under the current rules, they were surprised. A couple even asked for the name of the nursery where I'd bought my plants. The board, however, wasn't slowing down. They scheduled a special meeting to vote on the amendment. Bright yellow notices went up on every mailbox post, announcing the date and encouraging all homeowners to participate in protecting our neighborhood standards. The days leading up to that meeting felt like a Cold War. Neighbors who used two-wave now avoided eye contact. Conversations at the mailbox were clipped and polite. Even the air seemed heavier, as if the street itself knew a confrontation was coming. Meanwhile, I worked behind the scenes. I printed copies of the drought order and city landscaping recommendations, highlighting the parts that encouraged water-saving designs. I put together a short, simple handout explaining how xeriscaping could save homeowners hundreds of dollars a year. And I gathered quiet promises from those willing to vote against the amendment. The night of the meeting, the community center was even more crowded than before. People stood against the walls, fanning themselves with folded papers. The board president opened with a speech about preserving our community's charm, painting the amendment as a necessary step to protect everyone's investment. It was polished, rehearsed, and aimed straight at people's fears. When they opened the floor for discussion, I didn't rush to the microphone. I waited, letting others speak first. Some supported the change, parroting the board's talking points. But then a neighbor from 2 houses down stood and said they liked my yard, that it was neat and attractive, and fit the desert climate better than grass. Another neighbor mentioned their skyrocketing water bill. The tide didn't turn completely, but cracks were starting to show. When my turn came, I kept it short. I reminded everyone that this wasn't just about my yard. It was about giving the board more power to dictate what we could and couldn't do with our own property. I handed out the city documents, the cost savings, the drought data. I spoke about the importance of choice, not just conformity. The vote was taken in silence. Ballots were collected in a metal box at the front of the room, and the board disappeared into a back office to count them. The rest of us waited, the air thick with tension. When they finally returned, the president's expression told me everything before he even spoke. The amendment had failed by only a handful of votes, but enough to kill it. There was no applause, no cheering, just the quiet shifting of chairs as people began to leave. The board avoided my eyes as I walked past them, my binder tucked under my arm. They hadn't won this round, but I could feel their resentment burning hotter than ever. And sure enough, they found a new way to fight back. 2 weeks later, a city inspector showed up at my door. The knock came mid-morning, sharp and deliberate. When I opened the door, a man in a light blue, city-issued shirt stood on the porch, clipboard in one hand and a badge clipped to his belt. His expression was professional, but not unfriendly. He introduced himself as a city code inspector and said he'd received a formal complaint about my property. It didn't take a genius to figure out where the complaint came from. He stepped onto the sidewalk and began taking notes, occasionally snapping photos of my yard. The cacti, the stone pathways, the decorative boulders, all recorded in meticulous detail. I stayed calm, watching as he moved from one corner of the property to another. When he finally lowered the clipboard, he explained the nature of the complaint. Allegedly, my landscaping violated city ordinances regarding yard maintenance and public safety hazards. I asked him directly if cacti counted as a hazard. He chuckled and admitted the ordinance was vague technically. Any plant with spines could be classified as hazardous if it posed a danger to pedestrians. But he also said that my yard was fully enclosed by a low decorative wall and that the plants were set far enough back from the sidewalk to pose no risk. From a safety perspective, I was fine. As for yard maintenance, he flipped through his notes, glanced at my property again, said it was clearly well maintained, clean, orderly, and free of debris. The complaint, he said, appeared to be more about aesthetic preference than any real code violation. Before he left, I asked if this kind of thing happened often. He gave me a knowing smile and said, "You'd be surprised how many of my calls come from HOAs trying to make their problems into the city's problems." Then he handed me his card and told me he'd file a report clearing the property of any violations. I thought that might be the end of it, but 2 days later, another inspector arrived, this one from the county's environmental office. The complaint this time alleged that my landscaping disrupted stormwater drainage and could contribute to erosion. Again, the inspection revealed nothing of the sort. My yard had proper grading, and the stone pathways actually helped control runoff better than grass. The inspector left, shaking his head, muttering something about petty neighbor wars. It became clear that the HOA was trying to bury me in inspections, hoping that if they filed enough complaints, eventually one would stick or at least exhaust me into compliance. But every time the result was the same. No violations, no citations, no grounds for removal. Still, the constant visits drew attention. Neighbors noticed the city trucks parked outside my house week after week. Some began asking questions, and when I told them the truth, a few were shocked at the lengths the HOA was going to. One even admitted that a board member had stopped by their house, suggesting they also file a complaint to speed things along. They hadn't done it. But the fact that the board was actively recruiting allies told me just how desperate they'd become. The turning point came a month later, when a third inspector, this time from the state's water conservation agency, showed up. Unlike the others, he wasn't here because of a complaint against me. He was here to award me a rebate, apparently. My xeriscaping project qualified for the state's drought-tolerant landscaping incentive program. Something I hadn't even applied for, but had been flagged during the earlier inspections. The rebate wasn't huge, just a few $100s, but it was enough to make me grin when I deposited the check. The same HOA that had fined me for my neglected lawn had indirectly triggered a payment from the state for making it more sustainable. That little irony didn't stay private for long. I made sure a copy of the rebate notice ended up on the community bulletin board, right beneath one of the HOA's stern reminders about neighborhood standards. By then, the board's tactics were unraveling. They'd failed to fine me under the old rules. They'd failed to pass new ones. They'd failed to weaponize the city. But I knew they weren't finished yet. When the next letter arrived, it was clear they were going for their final move, one that had nothing to do with rules, votes, or inspections. They were threatening to sue. The envelope was thicker than the usual HOA correspondence, sealed tight and stamped confidential legal notice. Inside, a formal letter from the board's attorney claimed that my continued noncompliance had caused material harm to the community's property values. They intended to pursue legal action to compel me to restore my lawn to grass, as well as recover all outstanding fines and attorney's fees. The tone was smugly confident, but beneath it I could sense the desperation. This was their last card to play. I took the letter straight to my own attorney. He read it once, then let out a slow whistle. "They don't have a case," he said flatly. The HOA's entire argument hinged on the idea that my yard violated But the bylaws hadn't changed, and my yard was in full compliance. Worse for them, the city's drought, order, and environmental guidelines actually worked in my favor. My attorney drafted a firm response, pointing out every flaw. In their claim, he included photos, municipal documents, and even the state rebate approval as evidence that my landscaping was not only legal, but commendable. He ended the letter with a warning. If the HOA proceeded with a lawsuit, he would counterclaim for harassment and seek damages for their repeated, baseless enforcement attempts. 2 weeks passed in silence. Then, without fanfare, another letter arrived, not from the attorney, but from the HOA president himself. It was brief, almost terse. The board had elected not to pursue legal action at this time. Help me. No apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Just an abrupt retreat. Word traveled fast. Neighbors I barely knew started stopping me in the street, asking if it was true the HOA had backed off. Some offered congratulations. Others admitted they'd been rooting for me the whole time, but hadn't wanted to get involved. And slowly, the tension in the neighborhood began to ease. A few months later, something unexpected happened. Another homeowner, 3 streets over, replaced their grass with a succulent garden. Then another did it. By the end of the year, there were 6 drought-tolerant yards scattered through the community. Each one different. Each one a small act of quiet defiance. The HOA never challenged them. They could not without reopening the fight they'd just lost. As for my yard, it thrived. The cacti bloomed in the spring, bursts of yellow and red against the sandy earth. The stone pathways stayed neat year-round. My water bill stayed low, my weekends free from mowing and fertilizing.
Oh.
And every time I stepped outside, I was reminded that sometimes the best way to win is not to play by someone else's rules, but to change the game entirely. The HOA had fined me $500 for my lawn. In the end, they'd spent far more than that chasing a battle they couldn't win. And I'd turned their demand for perfect green grass into a permanent, legal, and untouchable desert sanctuary. They wanted uniformity. I gave them something unforgettable instead. Do like and subscribe for more story.